Hi, all. Kinsey Schofield here. I am so excited to be talking to the author of Traitor King, Andrew Lownie. Now, this is one of my this is a strange thing to tell you, but I love the cover. I love the colors. This is like displayed proudly in my bedroom. So I hope that doesn't start us off on an awkward moment. But I just love this cover. I love this book so much. That's my official endorsement. I hope that it's not too strange for you.
Well, thank you. No, I'm thrilled. I mean, it's a great cover. I mean, the cover and funny enough, they've all the publishers have picked very striking colors, the orange and all sorts of things, turquoise. So they clearly stand out in the bookstores.
Absolutely, they do. Now, what I found so interesting about this is I've read a ton of books about Wallace and Edward, but this is one of the only first book I think I've read that says, you know what, the abdication is the smallest part of this story. And these two people might be worse than we ever imagined. I mean, I hate to say that, but I really did not like them when I ended this book. Was that your intention? Were you not even thinking about that? You just wanted to get the truth out there. I mean, I love the book because I'd never read anything like it. It was so unique, but I didn't necessarily like the characters, which is strange to say, right?
No, they are pretty pathetic people. I mean, no, I started off with a completely open mind. I wasn't sure what I was going to find, but I did feel that the everyone concentrates on the abdication or forgets how much of their lives were lived after the abdication. 50 years for Wallace, and most books just cover the last few years, the last 50 years in a few pages. So it does give a completely different take because they're presented in the abdication story as these star-crossed lovers who've been thwarted, and he gives up the throne for the woman he loves. And actually, when you look at it with a slightly different perspective, it's a very different story. It's about a woman who was trapped into marrying a man she didn't really like, just because she happened to be there when the music stopped in 1936 and their relationship after that, and the way that they were marginalized by the royal family. Lots of parallels clearly with Harry, and were rather, as you say, pathetic figures. I'm always interested in what I call the rogue royals, the ones who are perhaps not the goodies, but the baddies in the story. And this is why I'm doing Andrew and Fergie next. Uh, but they are much more interesting as characters, and it's clearly a case of wasted lives. But also, what I think is so interesting is the cover-up that went on to cover up his activities as a Nazi sympathizer.
Yeah, and I think Americans won't necessarily be surprised by that because a lot of them, some people will slap me on the hand for this, but truly, I think a lot of people watch The Crown and consume it as fact. And The Crown didn't hide. I mean, The Crown was, I think they made the actual royal family very unhappy in the fact that they flirted with that storyline a little bit. But you really go into it in here. Were you this I know the answer to this question because you've actually been very courageous throughout your career, but were you at all nervous about investing time in that part of history?
No, no, it's a fascinating part of history, and they're fascinating characters. And you're absolutely right. The Crown, to its credit, has dealt with some subjects that people have shied away from in the past. I mean, the other one is Philip's affairs. And I'm a great admirer of The Crown. I mean, not just for its production values and its acting and the script, but because in some ways it tells greater truths, even when it's playing with the facts, than in fact the non-fiction books do. I think their insights into character and their way of dealing with some tricky subjects has been very skillful. But no, I mean, I'm often attacked as someone who is anti-monarchy because I do like often critical books about the royal family, but I write actually as an admirer of the royal family and as a monarchist. But because I am, I want to hold them up to the highest standards. And when some of them, I'm afraid, like Harry and the Duke of Windsor and others, fall below those standards, I think they should be called out. There's no free pass just because you're a royal, and they're certainly not above the law. And I think it then, I hope, shows that the ones who do behave and do follow a lifetime of public service, like the Queen and Prince William and Catherine, we will respect them all the more. But I don't think these people deserve our respect. They certainly don't earn it.
That's the thing because I think one reason we're fascinated by Harry or Wallace and Edward is because we can't imagine being in their situation and screwing it up so bad. You look at the life they've been given and you're like, I would do a million things differently. I would be so grateful for that. I would feel the privilege. And a lot of times you just, especially with these two, it feels like they wallow in their own misery. They don't realize that even in exile, the fact that they never have to take care of the check. I mean, even in exile, these two are living a very privileged life. I wanted to ask you kind of about that. I've always assumed, and I've heard you joke about Madonna's movie We, which I'm going to say I love. I'm sorry. Please don't be mad at me. But I've always assumed these two were flighty and self-consumed. But they're actually potentially pretty dangerous when you read some of your book. Uh, the idea that the prince was an idiot. I mean, he probably was an idiot, but I never assumed he was capable of scheming as much as he did. Was his motivation vengeance? Was his motivation, was he trying to prove something? What was his motivation in the work he did behind his family's back that makes him the traitor king?
Well, I mean, he's often portrayed as naive, and you could say he was a useful idiot who was played by the Germans. But the fact is, as I think I show from the book with looking at documents, I mean, he actively conspired against his brother and against the British. And it is remarkable because we think of him as a rather passive figure, but I think he was motivated by both personal vengeance against, in some ways, his family. He felt they'd rejected him and his wife. They weren't going to give her a title as Her Royal Highness. And also by a genuine belief that the Nazis believed in strong government. They were a bulwark against the communists. That he had very strong pro-German feelings. He was mainly German. He spoke very good German. He was anti-Semitic. I mean, even after the war, even after the Holocaust. So his political and his personal beliefs really came together. And I think there's no dispute. I mean, that he really wanted to get into bed with the Nazis. He was perfectly prepared to be a puppet king during the Second World War, and even during the war, he was prepared to try and keep America out of the war, and indeed to engage with pro-German Nazi spies and others. I hope that people have now, in a sense, we've recalibrated and we now see, what a serious threat he was. I mean, fortunately, he went off the Bahamas under the threat of court-martial, and he was partially marginalized. But, there were big attempts at the after the war to make sure that some of the evidence against him, which had been captured from German files, never saw the light of day. And for that, people like Eisenhower and Churchill have to be held responsible. They didn't want history to be told as it happened. They wanted to cover it up.
Yeah, I read that you went all over the world to search archives because do you call it dry cleaning? What do you call it when the archives have been touched up or are in some cases destroyed? But to research this book specifically, you had to go to the Bahamas. You had to go all over the world to do that. Is that correct?
That's right. I mean, I do make a point of trying to find archives that others haven't looked at, whether they're private archives or archives in other countries. And you're absolutely right. One of the problems is that archives, about 80% of public documents which should be kept are destroyed with no record kept, certainly in Britain. We have exemptions under the Freedom of Information Act, which means that stuff can't be released about the royal family. I mean, the files for the royal family closed going back to the 19th century. And you're absolutely right that when I went to the Bahamas, I found mirror copies of the Colonial Office files there. But they were much thicker files. They'd been very clearly the files in Britain for the Colonial Office and his period in the Bahamas had been completely weeded. And so, for example, his instructions to send the chief of police off to Trinidad on the morning of a murder in which he had been involved. Um,
We
um,
have to talk about Harry Oakes. Let's talk about Harry Oakes next. But yes, continue your thought.
so, I mean, there was a lot of material that was covered up, absolutely. And uh, my own feeling is that you will always find something. There's always a file, what we call a stray file, that gets filed in the wrong file. There are always relations who have stories to relate. So we don't necessarily have a record, but we have oral history, which I think can be perfectly useful. So, for example, the other day I was lecturing on the Queen Mary, and I said, well, it's very unfortunate we've never had any evidence to show that Wallis had an affair with Ribbentrop, the German ambassador, and they saw each other. And a man came up to me at the end and he said, actually, I'm the grandson of Ribbentrop's chauffeur. And my grandfather told me he was always taking Wallis to see Ribbentrop. Um, there's been a new book just come out claiming that the China dossier, which was an intelligence file collected on Wallis's sexual sort of behavior, which was used to discredit her, couldn't have existed because there are no files, there's no evidence of it. But the fact is, there are people who've seen it, perfectly reputable people who've talked about it. And one of the things I discovered was that only one of the files from special branches monitoring of Wallis, and we've got to remember that the intelligence services were spying on both the future king and his wife. Only one of those files has been kept on the grounds that the rest wasn't of interest.
Hmm.
And this is what worries me, that time and time again, people in powerful positions are destroying evidence which doesn't perhaps present them in the best light. And that is destroying our history. It's censoring the historical narrative.
I remember dying a little inside when I don't know if I read it or I heard Paul Burrell talking about watching Diana's mom, going through her office and just setting things on fire. And when I asked somebody about it, because I was actually horrified by it, they said, oh, aristocrats did that all the time. It was just something that they did. They just went and burned through everything. But especially when it comes to Diana, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist when it comes to her death, but other people are. You think about how valuable some of those letters, some of those pieces of paper could have been to prove something one way or the other. So I'm with you. It is wild the fact that people think it's okay to rewrite history, but you know what? Harry and Meghan try to do it every day. Will you talk to me about the murder of Harry Oakes? Because that was one of the most. I'm a true crime junkie too, so that was one of the most compelling stories for me.
Well, the Harry Hoax murder, I think, is one of the last unsolved murders of the 20th century that's well known. Harry Oakes was a great friend of the Duke of Windsor. He was probably the richest man in the Bahamas, and he was found mysteriously dead one day in July 1943. He'd been basically bludgeoned to death overnight. No one has ever been convicted of the murder. There are lots of theories about it, but it's very clear that there was some sort of cover-up. The Duke, when he was informed of the murder, immediately had a news blackout. Instead of calling in detectives from the FBI or Scotland Yard, or indeed police that were on the RAF base, he brought in two crooked cops who worked for a mafia figure in Miami, who basically tried to plant evidence of fingerprints on the son-in-law of Oakes to try and convict him. Unfortunately, the case he wasn't convicted. Um, the Duke made himself absent during the trial. They tried to deport Alfred Maroney, the son-in-law, when he was found not guilty. The man who probably committed the murder or ordered it to be committed, a man called Harold Christie, who was a business associate of the Duke and Harry Oakes, and who had fallen out with Oakes. He couldn't explain his movements. He was seen that night when he claimed to have been asleep. He was the man who discovered the body, but didn't realize that he was dead. It's quite clear that the body was moved, and is not. He wasn't murdered where he was found. So there are lots of unanswered questions, and I think what I found particularly interesting was that when there were opportunities to reopen the case at the end of the war, the Duke made sure that the case was not opened, and the Scotland Yard file on it remains to this day, some 80 years later, closed. And you have to ask why.
Yeah. Also, is there not $5 million involved somehow in this murder too?
Yes, there's $5 million that went missing. I mean, this is all tied into basically Harry Oakes Harold Christie and the Duke were involved in taking money out of the Bahamas and investing them in a Nazi bank in Mexico. And I think when they realized that people, or someone realized that the $5 million that Oakes had basically put aside to be moved would not be recognized or not discovered, they basically snaffled it. And certainly the Duke had a lot more money after July 1943 than he had before that.
That's not suspicious at all. Talk to me about in my neck of the woods, Scotty Bowers,
No,
the
Scotty.
famous Hollywood pimp. Ryan Murphy created a show about him. This story is almost too much to even. This sounds like something you'd script. It's almost too much to believe that this could be true.
I agree, and I found it. I was very skeptical of the Scotty Bowers story. Scotty Bowers, as you know, was a pimp to basically the Hollywood elite, and would find both male and female prostitutes for people. And he claims in his book and indeed in the television series that he was procuring both men and women for both Wallace and Edward. I interviewed the ghostwriter for the book. I interviewed the director of the program, both of them highly sensible, credible figures, and they totally believed everything that they'd been told by Scotty. Everything he'd said to them which they could verify, had been found to be true. And one of the things I found interesting is that there is evidence that the Duke and Wallace were bisexual. There's evidence that. They may well have, well, they had a very sort of strange sex life, but they were also very keen to cover up the story. They pretended that they hadn't been to LA until almost the late 1950s, and I found evidence that they had been. So why should they lie about that unless they were trying to cover up why they were there? And for example, in an auction, I came across love letters that had been written to a man by the Duke of Windsor. So, but there are plenty of people who've got evidence of their bisexuality. So, Scotty Bowers, who is not always taken very seriously, I think is a perfectly reputable source.
I love that. I've read that before, that some of the sources you found or some of the pieces of evidence you found through auctions, because that's just somebody finding something in their garage, not understanding what it is. Sometimes here in the States, people won't pay their bills on their storage units, and the storage unit will just auction things off, and you find celebrity prescriptions for medication. I mean, you find the craziest things. So how bright and sharp of you to know to go look in all these different directions, because sometimes when we pick up a new book that we're excited about in the royal community, you're just seeing people quoting other people, and there's it's not so unique in the way that you find things, the way that you go about it. Will you talk to me about this break-in? It's happening in 1946. Edward and Wallis decide, instead of using a vault, they're going to slide some jewelry underneath a bed. I think they're staying with friends. And then it doesn't turn out the way we think it turns out.
No, the Ednam Lodge robbery, I think, is very interesting, and it's very revealing about their characters. They go and stay with the Earl of Dudley, who's a friend. For some reason, they bring lots of their jewels with them. They refuse to put the jewels in the safe. They stick them under the bed. They open the window and they go out to the theatre in London. And surprise, surprise, someone shimmies in the window and nicks all the jewels. And they don't seem too upset by it. And they claim on the insurance, and that is sort of the end of the story between 1946 and the 1980s. After Wallace dies, there's a big sale in Geneva of her jewels, and one of the extraordinary things is that many of the jewels that were stolen suddenly appear in this sale. So there are two explanations. One is that they were not stolen, they were just claimed for insurance purposes. The other, that these are paste replicas. But then you have to ask, why is Sotheby's, who are clearly authorities, selling paste jewelry as real jewelry? So it's one of the really interesting questions. But he was involved in a lot of these sort of rather dodgy financial transactions. He was investigated by the French banking authorities in the 1950s for his black market currency dealings. His poor secretary took the rap and was sacked. He was involved in black currency dealings when he was in the Bahamas. And we clearly have the story of the money going to the Banco Continental in Mexico during the war. So this was a pretty dishonest man. He was desperate for money and he would do anything basically to make a quick buck, even if it was dishonest.
Well, one of the statements you've made previously is about some of these bad apples. And I think you're talking about Wallace and Edward. You're talking about Prince Andrew, in some cases, Fergie. And I think Prince Harry could fall in that category too. But you say the royals have become more ruthless in dealing with them. Have they become more ruthless in dealing with them since Wallace and Edward, or did you consider that ruthless? Because I almost feel like they weren't very ruthless. They got to go off into the sunset, and we whisper about how he finally got to be with his love. He gave up power for love, and that's not necessarily the truth. So they get to have this legacy that thankfully is being challenged by people like you. But I feel like perhaps they're more ruthless today with Prince Andrew and Harry, but I almost feel
Absolutely.
like these two got off easy.
Yes, they did. They tried to marginalize them. They tried to work with him to a certain extent. I mean, he did go and visit his relations after the war, even though they knew, how he had behaved with the Nazis. So they kind of tried to keep him inside the tent, and that's always, of course, the balance. You don't want disaffected people who might sell your secrets. But certainly they're much more ruthless with Meghan and Andrew and others. I mean, there's clearly briefing against them, which is what Harry's been complaining about. They use tame historians to try and discredit people like me about what we find. They just say that we make the stuff up, even though everything is carefully sourced. So apart from the briefings against people, um, yeah, I mean, I think they make threats. So, for example, with Andrew, Amy Robotham of ABC actually discovered and wanted to interview Virginia Giuffre many years before the story broke. And the palace said to ABC, well, if you do that, then don't expect to ever do another interview with a member of the royal family. And ABC caved in. So they do have a sort of power. People, they need the press, but the press needs the royal family. And so there is this jousting between them the whole time. And anyone who's in what we call the royal rota, basically royal correspondence, depend on access, the information, the stories that they tell on having access to the royals. And so they can't really afford to break that relationship. I'm not part of the royal rota, I'm just an independent historian. And so it's much easier for me to just go and try and find the information by talking to people or looking at archives or whatever. But you're absolutely right. The way we research books has changed considerably, and we need to think outside the box. So, one of the great sources, for example, are forums. People will put things down privately in a forum of the royal family or the Royal Navy. Um, or they will put comments after a piece in the newspaper, and they will often talk about their engagement with that royal and provide new evidence to support whatever they're saying. So there are lots of places where we can collect information that we didn't used to be able to collect. And that's good. I mean, that
Yeah,
makes the whole process a little easier because otherwise it was a very a tightly controlled sort of source of information.
absolutely. Can I ask you about Harry and Meghan compared to Wallace and Edward? How far away from their cottage do Wallace and Edward rest? And do you think that annoyed Meghan that they were kind of shut off over here with the other outcasts?
Well, I mean, the Frogmore, which is where the Duke and Duchess are buried, I mean, it is the royal burial ground. I mean, there are lots of quite distinguished members of the royal family who are buried there. So I don't think Meghan should be upset.
Yeah,
And, clearly Frogmore Cottage was a pretty desirable residence. So I think it's
unless you're
just,
Prince Andrew.
sorry?
Unless you're
Not
Prince
as
Andrew.
not as big as Royal Lodge, but not bad. And yes, possibly the future home of Prince Andrew. Um, but I think the problem with Meghan is she's never satisfied with what she has, and she believes she's, I mean, we talked about the royals feeling entitled, but they're born into it. The
Mm.
extraordinary thing about Meghan is that she's sort of assumed this sense of entitlement, and all she's done is marry into the second son of the king.
And it's like not her first marriage. Like that's what blows my mind. Like if you had just paced yourself, been patient and waited for this opportunity, to me it would be one thing. If you waited all your life and you married the king and your background was completely squeaky clean, but she like I don't think she understood what a privilege it was that she was in a position to marry him when Princess Diana had to deal with her uncle in the papers talking about her virginity. I mean, I would die. Yeah, so she was in such a blessed position that they were so open and welcoming of her, at least in the public eye, because if public perception is that the queen loves you, then we are more apt to accept you faster because we believe that the queen loves you. And I just don't think that she realized how lucky she was at all from
No,
day
I think that's
one.
right. I mean, I think she was welcome not publicly, but also privately. I think the family, we have that scene with Prince Charles walking her up the aisle. They gave her all sorts of advisors to bring her in. It looked good for the monarchy, and they were happy that Harry had found, true love. But I think the problem with Meghan is she thinks she's bigger than this thousand-year institution, and I think everyone, Prince Philip famously said, you've just got to remember that, you're joining, in some ways, a firm, and, everyone may be doffing their caps to you, but it's to the institution. And you've got to remember that you're just a small cog in this big operation. And she felt she could change things, that she was a bigger figure than and a more important figure than she really was. So she lacks, like many of them, complete any sense of self-awareness, or any sense of humility, or indeed public service. And I think, people have called her out now and seen, what she's like. And I hope that perhaps Harry will eventually see that and perhaps move on to someone else who is perhaps a better bet for him, because she has done an enormous amount of damage to the monarchy, and in fact she's behaved so stupidly, that in some ways she's just been her own worst enemy. She could have been far more effective if she'd operated in a more subtle way, but that's, I'm afraid, not her middle name.
I think her own worst enemy is a great way to describe it. I've never thought of it that way, but it clicks. I think we look at the professional separation today, and I know that this has to be some sort of internal strategy that everyone's agreed upon, but I almost feel like it's beneficial to one person and one person only, and that's Prince Harry. People are more invested in him. They grew up with him. They loved him longer, so they're more likely to forgive him. And away from Meghan, I think people are more likely to forgive him when he's not standing next to her. I think her going off on her own, us seeing her on red carpet after red carpet, I think it just annoys us. So I know that this is a strategy that somebody has intentionally decided is beneficial to them because together they are toxic. But I think apart, there's really only one person that benefits from the positive press and the positive reaction, and that's Prince Harry. Do you get that sense at all?
Yes, I think Harry could work his way back. I've been criticized for saying it, but I think they've always left the door open in the hope that he might come back. There's clearly been briefing that he might come back. They're letting her hang herself with her own activities. They're both operating personally and professionally very separately now,
Mm.
and I think she's running out of road. I mean, she's failed at pretty much everything she's done recently, and I think there is a role for him, not necessarily as a member of the royal family, but he could still come to family gatherings. He could still do work for charities that he's involved in, like Invictus. I don't think we're going to see him having a full-scale royal role, but I think there's no reason why he shouldn't come back within the fold. If we think of Queen Camilla, how ostracized she was at one point. Everyone hated her, that thought that she would ever be queen. And yet now she's a national treasure because she's worked her way back into people's affections. And the royal family need as many boots on the ground as they can get. There's only William and Kate under 60 who are doing royal engagements. Andrew's children are not seen to be suitable. There's clearly priming of the moment of Edward's daughter, Lady Louise, to do something. But they're really short of people, and so they need Harry. And as you say, Harry has his following. People feel very sorry for him. He's a very charismatic figure. And I think people will forgive him to say, if he just says, look, I'm afraid, I went off the rails a bit here.
Yeah, I
Um,
think I think he has to apologize though, because the one thing that Queen Camilla never did was talk. And he talked. He talked and he was ugly.
well, I think, he was foolish. I mean, if if said, this isn't the life for me, I'm going off, and everyone would have said, well, good luck to you. We wish you well. He would have had plenty of money. He's got lots of trust money. He didn't need to go off and earn money. He certainly didn't need to badmouth his family. And I think, the relationship with his father, I think, could be repaired. I think the relationship with his brother, given what he said about Kate and the children, I think will be much more difficult. But I think William is a mature figure. I think he listens to Kate, who is an even more mature figure. And I think they will see for the good of the monarchy, it makes sense, at least in public, for them to be seen to be working together, as long as that woman, as they used to say of Wallace, but if you could also say of Meghan, is not part of the equation. We've seen it with Andrew and Fergie. Fergie has betrayed the family countless times, setting access to Andrew, monetizing her role, being pretty tacky, being very indiscreet about some of the things that she said, and yet there she is. She's still allowed to accompany them at Sandringham to church. She's still allowed to use her title as Duchess of York. They are quite forgiving people, and I think particularly Charles, particularly as he has grapples with his illness, I think is in a mood to sort of move on. So I think there are signs that things may come together. People want them to be a happy family, and not to be dysfunctional, and I think they realize that for the sake of the institution, they need to come together.
You have used some words to describe Wallace and Edward that remind me of Harry and Meghan in the past. You talked about their shallow lifestyle. That's what I see when I see Polo, the trailer for Harry's Polo series. You talk about materialistic. That's how I felt watching Meghan in $6,000 outfits while in poverty-stricken Colombia. But you also talked about emotional blackmail. And while it's the opposite for Wallace and Edward, it's actually Edward who's emotionally blackmailing Wallace. Do you get the sense, because I do, that Meghan emotionally blackmails Prince Harry?
Absolutely. I mean, Harry is a very damaged figure. He didn't really have a mother figure. I mean, his parents got divorced, and much as people love Diana, she was not always there. And so absolutely, and he has had mental health problems, and Meghan has capitalized on that. She's taken advantage of his vulnerability, and she's pretended to provide this support. But I think she's such a Machiavellian and scheming character that I don't trust anything that she does as genuine. I mean, she looks just so false. And I think that's what William was warning him against, even before he got married. Take your time. But, he was keen to settle down. And here was a woman who kind of launched herself at him, and made him feel wanted. His brother was happily married. He felt left out. And she took advantage of all these traits and the positions. So I personally don't think this is a genuine love match on her side. You're absolutely right. Edward loved Wallace more than Wallace loved Edward, and that's exactly the same here.
Oof. I wanted to touch base with you because I've watched you discuss the build of your upcoming Prince Andrew book. And you talk about how he might have utilized his official role within the royal family to kind of line his own pockets. And today we're hearing there's this tug of war when it comes to Royal Lodge. The king is saying, I refuse to help you. I would rather you move into Frogmore to kind of force your hand. I'm not going to finance your lifestyle in any way, shape, or form anymore. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we find out that Prince Andrew has somehow come up with the funds to take care of Royal Lodge and to, I guess, contractually fulfill his obligations to stay in this home, which can cost millions of dollars to keep up with this huge estate. Looking at the research you're doing for your book, um, do you feel like you might know where any of that money has magically come from that he's utilizing to shut his brother up for the time being and remain in Royal Lodge?
Yes, I mean, the money comes from trust funds, which he's inherited both from the Queen Mother and indeed money from his own mother. But he's made plenty of money over the years. I mean, there's lots of evidence of acting as a middleman in with various business figures, particularly with a man called David Rowland, who often accompanied him on these trips when he went out as a special representative, as a public servant to promote British trade. He was also doing business for himself and for people like Rowland on these trips. So he's been given lots and lots of watches. He was scrounging for money in the Middle East. So there are a whole series of people who I think very happily would settle his debts and give him money and have used him as a fixer. We've got plenty of evidence from, for example, various operations in Kazakhstan, in Azerbaijan, and the Middle East. Um, I don't think there's any doubt that he's monetized his royal position and his position as special representative in the way that Fergie has done as well. I mean, the rent on just one of Fergie's properties is about £250,000 a year, which is about the running costs of Royal Lodge. So just from one rental, they could afford to support the Royal Lodge. He pays a peppercorn rent. There are some renovations to be done, but he has plenty of money to do that. I mean, he's been selling. He sold a house that was gifted to him as a wedding present, Sunning Hill, for something like £8 million more than it was valued. He sold a ski lodge for something like £16 million, having not paid the full, the woman who sold it to, having not paid her the full amount because she was worried that he might not be able to afford it. So, like Windsor, they will take. They will never pay their way properly. There are lots and lots of freebies, and there are lots of, I'm afraid, people who like to hang around the royals and get invited to Buckingham Palace and all the other perks that they can get. Go to Sandringham. We saw it with Jeffrey Epstein, a good example. I mean, Epstein was basically supporting both Andrew and Fergie for years.
This is my last question, and thank you so much for your time.
No, it's a pleasure.
I read that Andrew might be it for you when it comes to the royals, that, that you might have gotten your fix when it comes to Royal Rebel books. But do you think you might reconsider for Harry and Meghan? Because I do think that that's in your wheelhouse, and you're obviously very knowledgeable about them. And whatever this is, whatever this is that this little bug or this tick that they have in them that make them not want to follow suit and not want to play by the rules.
Well, I mean, Harry and Meghan would be a great subject. I mean, the problem is writing about living royals is very difficult. There are lots of sensitivities. People are very discreet. I don't have the contacts with that circle. It's been hard enough with Andrew, who's a contemporary of mine, who's the circles I know. And that has brought me a lot of information just from people I've known working within those circles. I don't know anyone within Harry and Meghan circles. The next book I'm doing is going to be on Prince Philip,
Okay.
because
I did not know
we
that. I'm so glad to hear that.
so I'm announcing it to you on the here. I'm
Oh,
breaking the
good.
news. And there have been lots of books on Prince Philip who I admire, but there've been very little on his private life. And I think, now he's dead, now the Queen's dead. I think we can be slightly more open about his affairs,
Mm,
which have been long covered up.
wow.
So that plays, more to my strengths with documents. It's a slightly earlier period. So certainly I haven't ruled out doing Harry and Meghan, or indeed just moving away from the royals whatsoever. But Philip will certainly be the next book.
Well, I hope you'll sit down and talk to me about that too, because that sounds incredible. Thank you so much for your time today. I just can't stress enough how well researched, and I know you hear this all the time, but
That's kind of you. Thank you.
yeah, I love how well researched you are. And I'm sorry for the criticism you talk about getting and kind of the walls that block you, because I do think you have the best interest at heart. And the best interest is ultimately the truth, which is so important when it comes to us studying our past and history. So thank you for your time today. I hope I get to talk to you again soon.
Well, I
And
look forward to it.
This has been such a joy. So thank you so
Well,
much.
thank you. It's always lovely to talk to you. So I look forward to chatting again soon.